Will just having a positive mindset heal you from being with a toxic, narcissistic, abusive person? I want to talk to you about that today. This is one thing that gets difficult with this subject of positivity and will it fix you? Okay. And oftentimes you're going to see this inside of counseling and inside of therapy. Now, on my side, I see it from a completely different perspective, mainly because we have many people that come from counseling and therapists that end up dumping them to work with raw motivations because they get more traction and more stuff actually for themselves inside this than they have inside of therapy. Like from countless people that we've talked to that have spent tens of thousands of dollars over the past several years investing into multiple different forms of therapy and modalities to figure out that it's all giving them positive stuff on the surface that's still never getting deep enough inside to actually work through the healing that they deserve. We've had people that have left therapists. We have people that have joined us and been like, hey, I learned more in a month than I did in a year of therapy, because we start actually applying it differently than what a therapist might do. One of the things that people say a lot of times is the therapist is focusing on just being like, hey, you need to have a positive mindset. That's great and that's helpful, and it does have some huge benefits in it. But does it actually heal you from narcissistic abuse? Does it actually break you free from the bonds, from the chains, from the slavery that you have with a toxic, abusive person? Typically, no. We'll see people that are like, I've been working on my mindset, I've been changing, I have all this positivity stuff, but I still want him. I'm still addicted to him. I still want to go back. Oftentimes, positivity, positive mantras are not good enough. Now, is this me bashing on all therapists? No. I meet with one every single week. It's great. You have to find the right one. Sometimes they're really hard to find. We have multiple people inside our programs that use the stuff inside here to take into therapy as well. So there's multiple modalities and way to do it. The thing I want to ask you today is like, will just a positive mindset fix you? Simple answer, I believe, is no. It won't bring you to a place of where you actually are dealing with the stuff that's underneath. Hopefully I can illustrate and hopefully I can explain this, because it is hard to be able to break it down a little bit even when I'm trying to think of it here. There's typically this thing that's happening. So we're going to put, you've been dealing with narcissistic abuse. Okay? Inside of this, you're going to have, let's say, a therapist that tries to tell you, hey, we're going to work through this. We're going to give you a positive mindset and a new version of what happened. Now, this could be changing the story you believe. This could be changing your mindset about it, whatever it might be. So it's like narcissistic abuse. Okay, let's focus on, let's change this, and we'll just put down positive. Okay? Or we'll do positive mindset. Positive mindset. So then you're here and you're like, hey, now I have this positive mindset. Now I have this piece. And you're like, it doesn't really seem like it's actually doing what I want it to do. Like, it doesn't seem like it's actually fixing the problem. Oftentimes it will fall short in this regard, and you will still be stuck mentally and emotionally because the positive mindset is not enough to break free. Now, I want you to consider for a moment, consider like where you currently are. You currently have this story in your life. Okay? You typically, if you've been with a narcissist, you typically have a story that you're telling yourself, whatever it might be. I'll just write here, I am not good enough. Okay? Now, it looks great because you're like, hey, totally get this. This is exactly what it is. Now, the hard part is typically when you're dealing with narcissistic abuse and you're starting to work through this, this is not enough to be able to figure this out, because it's one thing for me to be able to say, oh, this is what you're struggling with. It's another thing for you to actually see this and actually hear it. Typically, I am not good enough is way deeper than the first thing you think of. Okay? Typically, it has something to do with him. Typically, there'll be a story that'll be running through your head of, he treated me this way, therefore I'm not good enough. Like, I'm not good enough because of something he did. I'm not good enough because of what he said to me. Because of what he said to me. And then you go another layer and you go another layer and you're like, well, maybe if I would have done something different, maybe I would have been good enough. So I want you to understand really quick, and I don't know if this will even make sense to people, but I want you to understand, typically you have, let's erase this. I don't want this to look too confusing. Typically you're going to have this initial story that you have in your life, whatever it might be. You know, because he left me, I'm not good enough, and blah, blah, blah. Okay? Then you have this piece of like, let's take a positive mindset And typically it gets set on top of this story. Okay. And you know, in your mind, you know, hey, this is false and this is true. Right. So it seems like a good thing, right? It's like a positive, like, okay, this is what I need to think. Now, the hard part is, let's put it this way. The hard part is, we'll label it this way. Your story, the new story, the new positive mindset you need to believe is a square. Okay? This thing right here is a circle. They don't match. Like, well, wait a second, but it should be fixing because it's a positive mindset. The problem is the story that you're actually trying to be able to work through, the positive mindset might be incorrectly lined up. I feel like I'm not making sense. All right, we're just going to try this. Okay, it might not be correctly lined up. So you might have a specific story. Let me draw it like this. Okay, this might be, so we're going to do like a bullseye. Okay, this might be the story that needs to get impacted, the one in the middle. And the positive mindset piece is hitting over here. Okay, and this is the story. Oops, this is a story you need to believe. Okay, or this is the story you're telling yourself. What we'll see a lot of times is people will get to the place where they're currently getting a positive mindset impressed upon them, but it's not always the exact piece that they're trying to be able to get. Like, it's not always the exact piece that they need. I don't know if this makes sense. I'm trying to think of another way to be able to put it. Like, what we'll see is someone that doesn't actually get the right layer actually hit. So you'll see a therapist that will be like, oh, that's what you're dealing with? It's this. Let's just have you focus on this. And while it might be great and good, it might be helping you in a certain area, it doesn't actually deal with the root of the problem. Typically, when people have a story in their mind, when they typically have like, oh, this is what's going on, they have the initial, like they have the first one that they think of, and that one's normally pretty easy. Like, oh, this is what I'm thinking. Then they typically have like the second one that's underneath, which is like a modification of that initial story. Then they typically have a third one, which underneath that is like typically very drastically different than the first, and sometimes feels it gets out of left field. It's like, where did this story even come from? And then typically the fourth story that they come up with is typically the actual one, but it's more succinct. We're like clarifying, we're building it down. Now the thing is, this is all the same thing that we're talking about. Okay? So like it's all the same aspect of like, I wasn't good enough, that's why he left me, but then it boils down to, hey, I wasn't good enough. It might not be the best illustration because I'm trying to like think of like just different versions of it. Everybody's story is completely different. But the initial story that you're thinking typically is not what's actually there. The problem is a lot of positive mindset mantras and good things typically are only addressing the first or the second layer. They're not actually getting deep enough. Okay, so until we get deep enough inside this, you'll typically have these great tools that are positive and helpful in some ways, but they're not actually dealing with the problem to the fullest. This is why when we work with people, we have to help coach them into finding what is the actual story you believe. Because if you don't get down to the truth of that, you're trying to layer something on top that's not actually eradicating that story, but just putting some positive layers and making that story kind of disappear and fade back even more. But it's not dealing with the initial story that you believe. Now, all these stories are given to you by the narcissist, and you start to create on your own by being in a toxic relationship. Because of how he treats you, you start to think, well, I must not be good enough, okay? It's either done that by he's told you this, he's placed it upon you, or you started to tell that to yourself because of the relationship. So there's a piece you need to understand. These stories become something that are impressed upon you, that you start to learn from childhood, from education, from religion, from previous partners, and they're also ones that you start to create. Sometimes we'll term them as limiting beliefs, like things that are holding you back. Those are just stories. Those are just lies that you've been believing over a period of time that make you feel stuck. So part of this is to be able to say, like, do I think a positive mindset will actually fix you or actually change the problem? Typically, no. Do you need a positive mindset to grow? 100%. It's super helpful. But is it actually going to fix or break narcissistic abuse or the trauma bond or the addiction for that other person? Typically not. Because they'll help you actually rewire your mindset, change what's false to true. You're not going to change. And a positive mindset will be great, But if it's misfiring and it's not actually hitting you at the level that it needs to, it's not going to change you long term. It's going to minimize or even sedate the things that are underneath. And then as you get farther into a new relationship, you'll get this trigger that comes up and it's still pulling this old story that's been buried underneath years of stuff that's happened that you realize this actually hasn't been dealt with. This is why many times we'll be dealing and working with people with narcissistic abuse, and then we have to help them deal with like childhood trauma, or we have to help them deal with like their worth or their value from their mom or from their dad early on, realizing there's different wounds that have happened from different parents. And this typically has to happen because you realize, hey, you're believing a story that isn't just about this guy. It goes all the way back because it's something that you're believing about you. That's the piece that we have to work on to help you change, grow, and develop so you can integrate fully of who you actually are and help yourself move forward in a positive environment. But again, this work isn't done just with positive mindsets and positive mantras. I don't work that way. But we see huge change that happen to the people that work with us because we help them rewire the mindset back to the facts. We're getting away from the fiction, back to reality of what's actually true. Not the stories he told you and not the stories that you told yourself. If I can help you with that today, please go to rawmotivations.com now.